So in this week's video, I'm going to show you how to chain a secondary piece of yarn onto your warp that you will then use to tie onto your end dowel. I'm going to use a separate piece of yarn, and it's actually going to be the same yellow as is in my warp, but you could use any type of yarn. So there's two different ways you can go about this. One is you can use some scrap yarn that you're going to completely remove from your warp when you're done. Or you can use some complementary yarn to your warp and you can leave it on your warp at the end. And which you do really depends on your project. So for some projects, you may want to have chained a second piece of yarn in to help secure and sort of stabilize your ends. But if you're looking for really open, stretchy ends, then you'll want to take this back off again. Okay, so we're gonna just start this as if we were going to do a normal crochet chain. So we're gonna start with a little loop like that on your crochet hook. And then actually, let's go ahead and put this over here. So we're gonna go ahead and pass this loop underneath because we want our yarn coming from the left side. So if we're working right to left, then we want our yarn to feed through from left to right underneath the warp. If you're working in the opposite direction from left to right, then this would be the other way around. Okay, so get that loop onto your crochet hook, and then very simply, and I think I'm gonna do this in sets of 2, I'm going to pass over the first 2 warp threads and catch my yarn, and then just pull through as if you were chaining. And you'll notice I decided to do 2 at a time. And you could do 1 thread at a time or 2 threads at a time. You could do more than that if you're using a really thin yarn, but do be careful that the more yarns you catch at once, you need to be very careful to keep a shed stick in your, in the middle of your warp, otherwise you won't know which threads are in order. So just be aware of that. Okay, so I'm going to just keep grabbing the yarn, trying to make it not too tight. And how tight you make this chaining just sort of depends on if you're going to be leaving it in at the end or not, and if you have some specific reason for it, like if you're going to be using it to stabilize and maybe gather your end a little bit. This will be easier when we do it down on this end because we have this dowel in here. When you're warping up, you could of course put a dowel here and a dowel here, and this is all dependent on if you're using a warping board. If I were warping on something else, like a picture frame, for instance, this would be a little bit easier. But it's not too difficult doing it up against something flat like this piece of cardboard, particularly since this isn't a very wide warp. Okay, so we have chained across the warp all the way to the other side. I'm going to cut this fairly long. So there's 2 steps to this. The first is that we're going to chain across these warps, and the second step is that we're then going to sew through these chains and loop it around this dowel, and that's how we're going to attach our warp to our loom. You can either leave a long tail on the yarn that you sewed across, or you can use a separate scrap yarn, especially if you're using a yarn like I am here that I think I'm going to leave as part of my warp, you may not want to waste the nice yarn. You may just want to use a scrap yarn. And that is what I'm going to do here. So I'm just going to cut that off short and pull it through. Now I'm going to come down and I'm going to chain across this end as well. And I will then come back to the video to show you sewing the chains onto the dowel. Okay, so I have now crocheted across the top and the bottom of my warp, and I'm now going to attach the chaining to my end dowels. And I'm going to use a blunt tip needle and some scrap yarn for this. I do usually recommend using cotton scrap yarn, but I didn't really feel like going and finding any, so I'm just using some acrylic instead. Okay, so thread your scrap yarn onto your needle and then tie the end onto your dowel. Length of scrap yarn, thread it on the needle and tie it onto dowel. And this is going to be very simple. So you're gonna lay your dowel next to your chaining, and then you're just going to pass the needle through both loops of the chaining. Doesn't matter which direction, just make sure you're consistent. So I'm doing mine from bottom up. And then I'm gonna come down over the top of the dowel and then go through the next chaining and underneath my dowel, and then come back around over the top. And so you're just gonna make a continuous circle like this through the 2 loops of the chaining, over the top of your dowel, and around. Try and keep your tension even as you do this, and you can do this as tight as you like. I recommend just going as tight as you can. All right, so once you do the last one, we're going to tie it off just by wrapping it around a few times. Try not to get that end in there. Okay. I usually don't cut my ends because I like to reuse my scrap yarn, so I'm just gonna leave that like that. And at this point, you can now go ahead and slide that up if you want. It doesn't matter when you do it. Now that it's all tied onto the dowel, everything will just slide up nicely, especially if you had nice tight tension on there. So I'm gonna do the same thing to the other side. Okay, so that should hold everything in place, and I can now slide this off. So I'm actually gonna take off my spacer dowel, and that will loosen things up. And now I can go ahead and slide my warp off of the warping board. This can now be taken to your loom. Okay, so here is the finished piece with the chaining still left on the top and sewn up into like a little bag. I haven't really decided what I'm gonna do with it yet, so I'm just gonna leave it like this until I decide. But I wanted you to see what this upper edge looks like with the chaining on. I really like how neat it looks. And then one thing I do wanna mention is that, yeah, I use this chaining to attach it to the end dowels, but you can also, even if you have warped up in another way, you can still add this chaining onto your sprung after it's all done. I kind of like using this to attach to my dowels anyway, and it just kind of makes it easy because it's then already on there and everything's nice and neat and you don't have to go and do an extra step of adding this chaining. But it is something that you could add after you're done with your warp if you wanted a nice neat finish to the edges that doesn't need stretch. All right, well, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.